We turn now to campaign 2018 local matters. Our focus is New York City's reddest district. The 11th district is the only district in New York City to vote for President Trump over Hillary Clinton in 2016. Today, we're focused on a race for the district's congressional seat. In the Republican primary, incumbent Congressman Dan Donovan beat out ex-con and ex-Congressman Michael Grimm following a last-minute endorsement by President Trump. Running against Congressman Donovan is Democratic nominee Max Rose. He joins me now to discuss the race. Max, welcome. So great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So again, you are running in a fairly conservative district. What makes you think that the voters of Staten Island and a little bit of Brooklyn, because your district encompasses all of Staten Island and a little bit of Brooklyn, what makes you think that they are ready for a Democrat?
So, I would reject the idea that my district is conservative or liberal, Democrat or Republican. What we see consistently from Staten Islanders and folks living in southern Brooklyn is really what we see throughout the country, which is that people want to vote for the person, not the party. They want an independent fighter, an independent leader, someone who's going to do what they say down in Washington, D.C., and they certainly haven't seen that from my opponent, Dan Donovan, and they haven't seen that from politicians on both sides of the aisle for more than a generation now.
Okay, so why is Dan Donovan not the man for the job, and why are you?
Sure, Dan Donovan hasn't gotten anything done. Dan Donovan, beyond that, I'm not sure if the guy actually believes anything. We saw in his primary, he ran all the way to the right, then he tacks back to the middle. He really just his actions are dictated by polls. He's got zero spine, zero energy, zero results. And people deserve more than that. And I think what you see in me is a career track record of public service. I'm not a politician. I'm someone who's dedicated to results, whether it's my time as a healthcare executive, my time leading soldiers in combat. I'm the first post-9/11 combat veteran to run for any elected office in New York City history.
Tell us about that. Why is that significant to you?
Sure. Well, it's not just significant to me. I think it's significant to people living in my district because I have consistently put the country first, even when we put everything on the line. But more importantly than what I've done, what's important is the soldiers who I've served with. And I've seen people do unbelievable things, putting the interests of the mission and their country ahead of their own selves. Deployment after deployment after deployment. We need to see more of that in Washington, D.C., and we haven't for so long. That's why this is important.
And this is your first time running for public office. What was your aha moment? What made you decide to get into this race?
Sure. I don't think it's an aha moment. What I do think, though, is it's a commitment to public service. And it's the same desire, that same urge that drove me to enlist. I don't want to sit on the sidelines for this. The other day, I'll give you an example. I knocked on a door. Right? And a cop answered this door. And he says, my daughters are now afraid to go to school. They're afraid that they're going to get gunned down on the way to math class. I mean, how disgusting is this that Congress can't even solve the problem of gun violence? It's horrific. So I and so many others right now are saying we're going to run and we're going to fix this.
And so how are you campaigning? Are you a big, door-to-door, kissing the baby, shaking the hands? Do you have a big social media campaign rolled out? We've seen the power of those viral social media videos.
Sure.
What's your campaign
So
like?
we are going door to door to door, and my campaign has an army behind us. And that's why I think you saw in my primary, I won 2/3 of the vote in a 6-way race. And we didn't do that by going on TV. In fact, we didn't do one TV commercial. My opponent in his primary, and I'm sure you reported on that primary extensively, he put millions of dollars into that primary. Every special interest in Washington, D.C. bailed him out. Meanwhile, we organized neighborhood by neighborhood. And I think that we have built a coalition that this district has never seen.
Yeah, we're finding that a lot of these congressional races are not about money right now. They're about other things.
No.
I want to get sort of down and dirty into your platform and do a little, a little rapid fire question about what you believe. Should health care be a universal right for Americans?
Of course, without a doubt. Without a doubt, no question. We shouldn't stop until we achieve that.
All right. Now, should there be public higher education? Should it be free?
No. So my belief is that everyone should have access to affordable education, and not just college education, but training programs and vocational education. There's 6 million jobs today that we cannot fill because we don't have the skilled workers to do it. So it has to be across the spectrum of employment.
So, but not necessarily free.
No, not necessarily free, but most certainly debt-free and most certainly affordable.
And in terms of health care, do you mean single payer?
No, as we look at health care, there's many different ways to achieve universal health care in a cost-effective manner. I've, throughout my campaign, said I don't think Medicare for all, single payer, is the answer. But I certainly think building upon the system that we have and controlling for costs. Look, I come from the healthcare space. It is ridden with excessive profit, excessive waste. We need to truly realign our system to value. And when we do that, we're not just going to have universal health care, because that's just one side of the coin here. Right. We need to also control for per capita costs, because that's a tax on the people who live in my district.
A lot of work has to be done on the billing side, too, right?
Oh, my God, most definitely. Right. A ton of work, but we also need to transition to a value-based system of care. Now, I know that's really getting wonky here, but if you go to a hospital, that hospital still gets paid by filling beds, right? Churning and burning. We need to have a system where hospital systems and healthcare organizations are paid for producing and maintaining health, not just for doing another service. That's going to take some work, but once we get there, we can truly have a great universal cost-effective system in this country.
All right. Next question. Max, should marijuana be legal for recreational use?
So certainly I think at the state level, it most definitely should be legalized. At the federal level, I do believe it should be descheduled to not only allow for the industries to flourish correctly, but also to properly allow for our criminal justice system to orient to the 21st century in an equitable manner.
Okay. And who would you like to see as the next governor, Andrew Cuomo or Cynthia Nixon?
I've already come out and endorsed Andrew Cuomo, but I'm focused on my race.
Sure.
So we're not going to endorse tonight. We're not stopping here.
And what is your feeling about President Trump? Some in your party are calling for him to be impeached. Do you believe President Trump should be impeached under current conditions?
Sure. So it would be irresponsible for me to come out and say something like that right now as an investigation is going on. And what I can tell you overall, though, is I'm not going down to Washington, D.C. with a pitchfork in my hand. If you think about what President Trump ran on, put things like immigration aside, this guy ran on talking about making our roads and our bridges great again. He spoke about eliminating the carried interest loophole so hedge fund managers don't pay lower tax rates than cops or firemen, the opioid epidemic. There were so many things that he spoke about. We all remember draining the swamp, right? Well, if he wants to start working on those things rather than giving away $1 trillion to people who don't need it, believe me, as a member of Congress, I'll work with him on that. That's what I'm focused on, actually achieving results, rather than continuing just this era of hyper partisanship. Let's get back to work. Let's get something done.
All right. What about ICE? Should ICE be abolished?
No. I do not believe that ICE should be abolished. I do believe that it has a role and function of which some of its actions right now are not it. Right now, today, in communities on Staten Island and throughout New York City, as a consequence of ICE's actions, people are afraid to report crimes. Rape, murder, abuse, fraud. That affects all of our public safety, as well as being generally inhumane. So I stand with the NYPD on this, both in terms of my defense of sanctuary cities and my belief that ICE has a role and function that it needs to go back to. This is, again, we can talk about sensible reforms here that keep security in mind, but also maintain our values. We have to go back to being a nation of values and common sense. I don't see any reason why we can't do that.
All right, Max, if you win, would you vote?
When
Would you vote for Nancy Pelosi for House Democratic leader?
No.
Can you explain?
Sure. I believe that the Democratic Party is in urgent need of new leadership. The party has lost the trust of voters, not only in my district, but throughout the country. And believe me, if you separate the parties and you just look at our policies, infrastructure, equitable growth, lowering per capita health care costs, those policies have massive support, but we've got to move towards being also a party that can garner people's trust and keep it, and we're not going to be able to accomplish that without new leadership.
Who would you vote? Who would you like to see in that role?
We'll leave plenty of time to the horse racing here, but first I'm going to win my own seat.
All right, so let's talk about another first-timer who did quite well in a race that she was not expected to win. What are your thoughts on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez?
Sure. I applaud her on her victory. I think that there are plenty of differences between her and I. You've touched on several of them. The Democratic Party is a big tent, and we are certainly going to take back the House. But more importantly, as everyone loves to talk about differences within the party, we should also talk about what the Republican Party is doing, shipping $1 trillion away to people who don't need it, maintaining itself as the party of special interests, the party of corporate PACs. Nobody is more fitting for that than Dan Donovan. The guy has taken over $500,000 from corporate PACs. I've taken the corporate PAC pledge. I'm not taking a cent from corporate PACs. That's what my campaign is about, and certainly we see from Dan Donovan, he's in the pocket of these special interests. They just bailed him out in his primary.
And we know Ocasio-Cortez had a lot of success at not taking any corporate money, but I'm wondering if you think that her platform is a little too progressive for the Democratic Party at large, or you think that there's room for that voice in the party?
Sure. So, I have no idea what these words mean anymore. Progressive, moderate, liberal. We throw them around so much. You went down some issues, and I've told you that I'm not in favor of Medicare for all. I'm not in favor of defunding ICE and things like that. Nonetheless,
well, she is a socialist. She calls herself a socialist. Yeah. So is that something that the Democratic Party can contain?
Well, she won her race, and I am looking and focusing on my race. I think that's what's especially important. But I think when it comes to the Democratic Party, because that's what's so critical here. What is the Democratic Party? I think the Democratic Party needs to be a party with big and bold and transformative visions for how we are going to solve our nation's problems. We need an Interstate Highway Act for the 21st century. We need to boldly tackle the opioid epidemic. And on Staten Island alone, we need to double the number of treatment options that we find. Gun violence. An AR-15 should never be sold in this country ever again. Universal background checks. These are not just issues with wide support, but they are totally possible in both today's climate and going forward. So that's what we should be focusing on, and I look forward to working with her on those things as a member of Congress.
Max Rose, thank you so much for coming in to see us today.
Thank you so much for having me.